Injured deer seeks help from boy. What happens next will bring you to tears. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The dense forest surrounding the small village was alive with whispers of wind rustling through the leaves. It was early morning, and the dew on the grass glistened like jewels in the golden sunlight. Birds chirped cheerfully overhead, but their songs were drowned out by the faint, uneven sound of footsteps. A small boy, no older than 8, moved cautiously along the narrow dirt road that ran alongside the forest. His name was Ethan. He wore a clean white shirt and slightly worn jeans. His hair tousled from an earlier attempt to comb it. He had been sent by his mother to fetch some bread and eggs from the nearby farmhouse. The boy's parents had raised him to be kind-hearted and observant, traits that sometimes made him stand out from other children in the village. Ethan had walked this path countless times before, but today felt different. Something made him pause mid-step. He looked down at the uneven gravel beneath his feet, then raised his eyes toward the forest's edge. The sunlight streamed through the trees in soft beams, casting a warm glow across the underbrush. That's when he saw it. At first, Ethan thought it was a trick of the light, but no, there was movement. A flash of tan fur, and then the stillness of silence. His heart skipped a beat as he took a small step forward, narrowing his gaze. Slowly, emerging from the thick trees, a figure came into view. It was a deer, a young doe, but something wasn't right. The doe moved with great effort, her legs wobbling as though each step pained her. Her large, dark eyes searched the area warily, and it was clear she was struggling to keep going. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He could see a dark stain trailing down her side, barely visible through her fur. She was hurt. Without thinking, Ethan stepped off the road, his small sneakers crunching softly against the grass. He moved cautiously so as not to scare the doe away. His movements were slow, deliberate. "Hey there," he whispered gently. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The deer stopped, her delicate frame trembling as she turned her head to look at the boy. Ethan froze. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, locked in a silent understanding. The boy had seen plenty of deer from afar, but never had one let him get so close. The animal's eyes, wide and pleading, seemed to be asking for help. Ethan felt it deep in his chest, a connection he couldn't explain. The doe took another unsteady step toward him before stumbling and collapsing to the ground. Ethan gasped softly, his heart pounding. "Oh no," he murmured, rushing closer but still cautious. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't leave her there alone. He brushed his fingers lightly against the doe's fur, feeling the warmth of her body. She flinched slightly but didn't move away. "You're okay," Ethan said softly. "I'm here." His voice was soothing, though inside he was panicking. He glanced down at her side and winced when he saw the small but deep wound. A thin trickle of blood stained the grass. Ethan looked back toward the road. He thought about running for help, his parents, maybe the village doctor, but he was worried about leaving the deer alone. What if she tried to move and made it worse? What if a predator came along? He bit his lip and glanced around. Then an idea struck him. "There's a barn nearby," he said softly, as if the deer could understand him. "It's not too far. If I can get you there, we'll figure something out." The doe blinked slowly, her breathing uneven. Ethan took that as silent agreement. "Okay," he said, determination swelling in his chest. He stood up and glanced around, searching for something he could use. He noticed a fallen branch nearby and grabbed it, using it to gently encourage the doe. "Come on, girl. You've got to get up." The deer tried to move, her slender legs struggling to find strength. Ethan crouched low again, whispering words of encouragement. "You can do it. Just a little farther. We'll find help, I promise." Finally, after a moment of struggle, the deer managed to stand. Her legs were shaky, but she held her ground. Ethan smiled despite the worry gnawing at him. "Good girl," he murmured. He began walking slowly, turning his head every few seconds to make sure the doe was following. She limped after him, pausing every so often to rest. The journey was agonizingly slow, but Ethan refused to leave her behind. The barn wasn't too far, just beyond the meadow and down a slope. With every step, the boy's resolve grew stronger. "Almost there," he said quietly as they reached the edge of the meadow. The tall grass swayed gently in the breeze, golden in the morning light. Ethan led the deer carefully, making sure to avoid any holes or rocks that might trip her. It felt like hours had passed by the time they finally reached the barn. The old wooden structure stood tall, its faded red paint chipped and worn. Ethan had been there many times before to help the farmer, Mr. Andrews, with odd chores. He knew there were blankets and fresh hay inside, which would make a good temporary spot for the injured deer. He opened the creaky barn door and turned back to the doe. "Come on, it's safe in here." The doe hesitated, her large eyes scanning the interior warily. Ethan didn't push her. Instead, he stepped inside first, grabbing a few soft blankets from a shelf and spreading them out in a cozy corner. He grabbed a small bucket of water and placed it nearby, just in case. When he turned back, the doe had made her way inside. She looked exhausted, her sides rising and falling with each labored breath. Ethan guided her toward the blankets. She sank down gratefully, her legs folding beneath her. Ethan knelt beside her, brushing his hand gently across her neck. "You're safe now," he said softly. "I'll go get help." He stood up and turned toward the door, but then he froze. A soft, pitiful noise stopped him mid-step. He glanced back at the deer and realized she was looking at him with wide, pleading eyes again. The boy's heart ached. He couldn't just leave her. "Okay," he murmured, returning to her side. "I'll stay for a little while." Ethan sat down on the hay beside her, his back resting against the wooden wall. The barn was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves outside and the occasional creak of wood. Sunlight streamed through a small window, bathing the space in a warm glow. Ethan watched the doe as she began to relax, her breathing evening out slightly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread his mother had packed for him earlier. He broke off a tiny piece and held it out. "Do you want this? It's just bread, but it might help." The doe didn't move for a moment, but then she leaned her head forward and sniffed at the offering. Slowly, cautiously, she accepted the bread from Ethan's hand. The boy grinned. "See? You're already doing better." Hours seemed to pass as Ethan kept watch over the deer. Eventually, the barn door creaked open, and a familiar voice echoed inside. "Ethan? What are you doing here, boy?" It was Mr. Andrews, the farmer. He looked startled to see the boy sitting in his barn, and even more shocked when he noticed the injured deer resting nearby. Ethan scrambled to his feet. "Mr. Andrews, she's hurt. I found her in the woods, and I didn't know what else to do." The farmer's expression softened as he took in the scene. He nodded slowly, his eyes kind. "You did good, son. Real good." Mr. Andrews stepped into the barn, his boots making soft thuds against the wooden floor. The sunlight caught in his weathered face, highlighting the years etched into his skin. His eyes, though stern, were kind as they shifted from the boy to the deer resting on the blanket of hay. "She's got herself a nasty wound," he muttered, kneeling slowly beside the doe. Ethan watched anxiously as the farmer carefully examined her injury. The deer flinched slightly at his touch but didn't try to move away. "Is she going to be okay?" Ethan asked softly, his voice laced with concern. Mr. Andrews sat back on his heels, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Hard to say, but you did the right thing bringing her here. Out there in the wild, with a wound like this, she wouldn't have lasted long." He patted Ethan gently on the shoulder, his rough hand reassuring. "You've got a good heart, kid." The boy smiled faintly, relief washing over him. "What can we do? Can you help her?" The farmer stood up, his back creaking as he straightened. "I'll do what I can. There's a vet in town who owes me a favor. I'll go see if I can get him out here. In the meantime, you stay with her. Keep her calm. Animals like this, they sense when someone means them no harm." Ethan nodded eagerly. "I'll stay with her." Mr. Andrews gave him an approving nod before turning and heading out of the barn. The door creaked shut behind him, leaving Ethan and the deer alone again. The barn was still, save for the distant sounds of farm animals outside and the occasional breeze rustling through the rafters. Ethan knelt beside the doe once more, offering soft words of reassurance. "You'll be okay," he whispered. "Mr. Andrews is getting help. You just need to rest." The deer blinked slowly, her dark eyes meeting his. Ethan felt the same silent understanding he had felt earlier in the woods, a connection that went beyond words. She trusted him, and he wasn't about to let her down. Minutes turned into an hour and then another. Ethan sat with the deer, occasionally adjusting the blanket or offering her water. He watched as the sunlight outside shifted, painting the barn floor in soft streaks of gold. He didn't feel bored or restless. Instead, he felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he had ever experienced before. Eventually, the barn door creaked open again, and Mr. Andrews returned with a tall, serious-looking man in tow. The man carried a black bag, the kind Ethan had seen doctors use. "This is Dr. Mills," Mr. Andrews said, gesturing to the vet. "He's one of the best in town." Dr. Mills nodded curtly, offering Ethan a small smile. "You must be the one who found her," he said. "Good work, young man. Let's see what we can do for her." Ethan stepped back, watching as the vet knelt beside the deer and began his work. He moved with practiced skill, his hands gentle as he cleaned the wound and examined her carefully. Ethan couldn't see everything he was doing, but he noticed the deer remained surprisingly calm throughout the process. It was as though she knew they were trying to help her. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Mills sat back and let out a satisfied sigh. "She's lucky you found her when you did," he said, turning to Ethan and Mr. Andrews. The wound wasn't too deep, but infection had already started to set in. "I've cleaned it out and stitched her up. She'll need time to recover, but I think she'll make it." Ethan's face lit up. "Really? She's going to be okay?" The vet smiled and nodded. "As long as she stays off that leg and gets plenty of rest, she'll be fine." Mr. Andrews clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder, grinning. "You hear that, boy? You saved her." Ethan beamed with pride, his heart swelling with relief. He turned to the deer, who lay still but alert on the hay. "You're going to be okay now," he said softly. The deer blinked at him, her gentle eyes seeming to convey gratitude. Dr. Mills packed up his bag and stood, brushing off his knees. "I'll come back in a few days to check on her. Keep her comfortable in the meantime, and make sure she eats and drinks. I'll take care of her," Ethan promised, his voice firm with determination. Mr. Andrews chuckled. "I don't doubt that for a second." The following days passed in a blur of quiet moments and small victories. Ethan visited the barn every morning and afternoon, bringing fresh water and soft food. At first, the doe was wary, but soon she grew more comfortable with the boy's presence. Ethan would sit beside her, talking softly as he stroked her fur. He told her about his family, about school, and about his dreams of one day working with animals. "You're my first patient," he joked one afternoon, smiling as the deer nibbled at a handful of hay he had brought her. "Maybe I'll become a vet like Dr. Mills. Wouldn't that be something?" The deer blinked lazily at him, her breathing slow and steady. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, and Ethan felt a warmth in his chest that he couldn't quite explain. As the days turned into weeks, the doe began to recover. Her strength returned little by little, and soon she was able to stand and walk short distances around the barn. Ethan watched her progress with pride, cheering her on with each small milestone. "You're doing great," he told her one afternoon as she took a few wobbly steps across the hay-strewn floor. "I knew you could do it." Mr. Andrews often watched from a distance, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've got away with animals, boy," he said one evening as he and Ethan stood outside the barn, watching the sun set over the fields. "Not everyone has that gift." Ethan shrugged, a shy smile on his face. "I just wanted to help her," the farmer chuckled. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Finally, the day came when Dr. Mills declared the doe fully healed. "She's strong enough to return to the wild, he told Ethan and Mr. Andrews as they stood in the barn. It's time to let her go. Ethan felt a pang of sadness in his chest. He had grown attached to the deer over the past few weeks, and the thought of saying goodbye was harder than he had expected. But he knew it was the right thing to do. The three of them carefully led the deer out of the barn and into the meadow. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm, golden light over the grass. The deer stepped cautiously onto the soft earth, her legs strong and steady. Ethan knelt beside her one last time, his hand resting gently on her neck. "You're free now," he whispered. "Go on. You'll be okay." The deer looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't quite explain. Gratitude, maybe, or understanding. Then, with a graceful leap, she bounded forward into the meadow. Ethan watched as she disappeared into the trees, her silhouette blending with the forest. "She'll be fine out there," Mr. Andrews said softly, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan nodded, though his eyes were misty. "I know." As they turned to head back to the barn, Ethan glanced over his shoulder one last time. For a brief moment, he thought he saw the doe standing at the edge of the trees, watching him. Then she was gone, vanishing into the wild where she belonged. Ethan smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. He had done something good, something that mattered, and he would never forget the silent bond he had shared with the deer who had trusted him when she needed help the most. The sun rose higher as Ethan and Mr. Andrews made their way back to the farmhouse. Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the deer following them. But she was gone, returned to the place where she truly belonged. A strange mix of sadness and pride swirled in his chest. "She'll remember you, you know," Mr. Andrews said, as if reading his thoughts. "Animals like that, they don't forget kindness." "You think so?" Ethan asked quietly. The farmer nodded. "I know so. It might be years before you see her again, or maybe you won't. But she'll remember you, boy." Ethan didn't say anything, but Mr. Andrews' words gave him comfort. He thought about the day he had found her lying on the road and the way she had looked at him with those wide, dark eyes, trusting him completely. Felt like a lifetime ago now. When they reached the farmhouse, Ethan's mom was waiting for him on the porch, a warm smile on her face. "How'd it go?" she asked. Ethan grinned, his chest swelling with pride. "She's back where she belongs. She's safe now." His mom pulled him into a hug, ruffling his hair affectionately. "You did a good thing, Ethan. Not everyone would have stopped to help." Ethan shrugged, though a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. It was the right thing to do. As he sat down for breakfast later that morning, Ethan found himself staring out the window at the fields that stretched toward the woods. Somewhere out there, the deer was finding her way again, stronger because of what they'd done for her. The thought made him smile. The weeks passed, and life settled back into its usual rhythm. Ethan returned to his chores and schoolwork, but he often found his thoughts drifting back to the doe. Every time he walked near the edge of the woods, he couldn't help but scan the tree line, hoping for a glimpse of her. He didn't tell anyone, but sometimes, in the stillness of the early morning, he swore he heard the faint rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, a whisper of her presence. One afternoon, Ethan was walking along the edge of Mr. Andrews' field, checking the fence line for damage. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. A light breeze carried the scent of spring, and the air was filled with the sounds of birdsong and buzzing insects. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye near the edge of the woods. Ethan froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He squinted, shielding his eyes from the sun, and for a moment, he thought he saw her. A flash of tawny fur moving between the trees. She was there, standing just at the edge of the forest, watching him. Ethan's breath caught. "Is that you?" he whispered. The deer stepped forward, her movements cautious but graceful. She stood in the sunlight now, her coat sleek and healthy, her eyes bright and clear. Ethan felt his chest tighten as their eyes met. It was her. There was no doubt in his mind. She had come back. "Hey there," Ethan said softly, taking a slow step toward her. He didn't want to scare her off, but he couldn't resist the pull of their connection. "I've missed you," The deer tilted her head slightly, as if she understood. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the world around them falling away. It was just Ethan and the doe, connected by something Ethan still couldn't quite explain. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, the deer turned and leapt back into the woods. Ethan watched her go, his heart pounding. He felt a pang of sadness to see her disappear again, but it was mixed with a deep, unshakable sense of joy. She was alive, thriving, and free, and she had come back to let him know. Ethan stood there for a while longer, staring at the place where she had vanished. A soft smile crept onto his face as he turned and made his way back toward the farmhouse. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again, but that was okay. She would always be a part of him, and he would carry the memory of their bond for the rest of his life. That evening, Ethan sat with his family at the dinner table, his mind still lingering on the doe. His mom noticed the faraway look in his eyes and smiled knowingly. "Something on your mind?" she asked. Ethan hesitated for a moment before shaking his head with a small grin. "Nothing, Mom. Just thinking about how lucky I am." His mom exchanged a glance with his dad, both of them smiling warmly. "Well, we're lucky to have you too," she said. "You've got a big heart, Ethan." Ethan ducked his head, embarrassed but happy. As he ate, he thought again about the doe, about the day he found her, the days he spent helping her heal, and the moment she had returned to say goodbye. He realized something then. Helping her had changed him. It had shown him how much good one person could do, even in the smallest of ways. Later that night, as Ethan lay in bed, he stared out the window at the moonlit fields. Somewhere out there, the doe was sleeping safely under the stars, and Ethan knew that, no matter what, they would always share a connection. "Good night," he whispered into the darkness, his heart full, and in the stillness of the night, it felt as though the forest whispered back. The days turned into weeks, and the memory of the deer remained vivid in Ethan's heart. He went back to his usual routines, helping on the farm, attending school, and spending long afternoons wandering through the fields. Yet no matter how much time passed, the encounter had changed him. There was something different about how he looked at the world now. He had learned that even the smallest creatures carried stories of courage, trust, and resilience. One sunny afternoon, Mr. Andrews paid Ethan a visit at the farmhouse. The old farmer had a twinkle in his eye and a small parcel tucked under his arm. "Brought you something," Mr. Andrews said as he handed the package to Ethan. "Figured you'd appreciate it." Ethan took the parcel and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a wooden carving of a deer, its figure smooth and beautifully shaped. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Did you make this?" he asked, his voice soft. Mr. Andrews nodded. "Thought it might remind you of her, of what you did for her. You've got a good heart, Ethan. Don't you ever lose that." Ethan ran his fingers over the carving, his chest tight with emotion. It was simple yet perfect, capturing the doe's grace and strength in a way that words never could. "Thank you, Mr. Andrews. This means a lot." The old farmer clapped Ethan gently on the shoulder. "Sometimes, life gives us these little moments, boy. Reminders that we're all connected to something bigger. You didn't just save her, you know. She saved a piece of you too." Ethan looked up at Mr. Andrews, a question lingering in his eyes. "Do you think she'll come back?" Mr. Andrews smiled faintly. "Maybe she will. Maybe she won't. Either way, you'll always carry her with you." That night, Ethan placed the wooden carving on his nightstand, where it caught the soft glow of the moonlight. He lay awake for a while, staring at it and thinking about everything Mr. Andrews had said. The farmer was right. Life gave you moments like this, moments that stayed with you forever. The following weekend, Ethan decided to visit the edge of the woods again. He walked slowly through the tall grass, his feet brushing against wildflowers as the wind carried the sweet scent of spring. He stopped near the spot where he had first found the deer lying on the road. The memory felt so clear, it was as if it had happened yesterday. Ethan sat down in the grass and listened to the sounds of the forest around him. Birds chirped in the distance, leaves rustled overhead, and the soft hum of insects filled the air. There was a peacefulness here that Ethan had never noticed before. a feeling that the world was alive and full of quiet beauty. As he sat there, he thought he heard a soft sound behind him, a faint rustling, like footsteps on the forest floor. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he turned slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line. There she was. The doe stood just a few feet away, her sleek coat glistening in the sunlight. Her dark eyes met Ethan's, and for a moment time seemed to stop. She was stronger now, no longer the fragile creature he had found on the road. She was wild, free, and alive. Ethan smiled, his chest swelling with a mix of joy and awe. "You came back," he whispered. The doe didn't move, but her gaze lingered on him, as if she understood. It was her way of saying thank you, of reminding him that their connection was something real and unshakable. After a long moment, the deer turned and disappeared into the woods, her movements silent and graceful. Ethan watched her go, a sense of peace settling over him. Years later, Ethan would look back on that moment as one of the most important of his life. The wooden carving still sat on his nightstand, a constant reminder of the bond he had shared with the doe. It was a story he would tell his own children one day, about the day a boy and a wild deer crossed paths and changed each other's lives forever. And though he never saw her again, he knew she was out there, thriving in the wild, a symbol of trust, courage, and the unspoken connection between all living things. Ethan never forgot the lessons she taught him. To be kind, to be patient, and to always take a moment to see the beauty in the world around him. Because sometimes it was the smallest moments, like stopping to help an injured deer, that made the biggest difference. As Ethan sat in the clearing, watching the forest breathe around him, he let out a soft sigh. His fingers brushed the blades of grass beneath him, grounding him to the moment. He thought about how much the world could change in the blink of an eye. A quiet road turning into a place of rescue, a deer's life intersecting with his, forever altering his path. The days and months that followed brought growth, not just for Ethan but for everyone around him. News of his act of kindness had quietly spread throughout the small town, a tale told over cups of coffee at the diner, at the corner store, and on front porches. It became more than just a story of a boy and a deer. It became a reminder to look out for one another, to care for the world that often went unnoticed. Ethan's father, once skeptical of his sons, daydreaming, now looked at him with new admiration. At dinner one evening, his father put down his fork, cleared his throat, and looked Ethan square in the eyes. "You did a good thing, son. I don't say it often, but I'm proud of you. You've got the kind of heart this world needs more of." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thanks, Dad." And though it was said in few words, the acknowledgement meant everything. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves turned shades of gold and crimson, Ethan woke to the distant sound of hooves on gravel. He sat up in bed, confused at first, before his mind raced back to a familiar memory. He pulled on his boots and rushed outside, his breath visible in the cool air. Standing just beyond the edge of the yard, partially concealed by a thin layer of mist, was the deer. Her presence was quiet, almost ethereal, as if she had emerged from a dream. Her coat shone in the morning light, and she looked healthier and stronger than Ethan could have ever imagined. And then he saw it. A smaller figure emerged from behind her legs, a delicate fawn with wide, curious eyes. Ethan's chest swelled with emotion as he realized what he was witnessing. The doe had survived, not just for herself, but for something greater. She had brought new life into the world. Ethan froze in place, afraid to startle them, but the doe met his gaze once more, her quiet strength resonating between them. It was as if she was saying, "Look what you saved. Look at what kindness can do." The fawn took a tentative step forward, testing its spindly legs on the uneven ground, before retreating to the safety of its mother's side. Ethan watched in awe as the pair stood there for another moment, before slowly turning back toward the forest. As they disappeared into the trees, Ethan felt a tear slide down his cheek, not from sadness, but from a deep, profound sense of wonder. It was as if the doe had returned one last time to show him that every act of compassion, no matter how small, could ripple outward in ways that no one could predict. Years later, Ethan would sit on that same front porch with his own children. The wooden carving of the deer still sat inside the house, a treasured piece of his past. He would tell them the story of a wounded deer and the extraordinary connection they shared. He would explain how it wasn't just about saving a life. It was about being open to the quiet moments that change us, the connections that remind us of who we are meant to be. And as the sun set over the distant hills, Ethan would look toward the woods, knowing that somewhere, the descendants of the deer still roamed free, alive, and carrying a piece of his heart with them. Because kindness, he learned, was never wasted. It was the bridge between us and the world, a bond that echoed across time. And no matter where life took him, that lesson would stay with him forever. The years rolled on like an endless wave, and Ethan found himself returning to that moment time and time again. A boy kneeling in the road, his hands brushing against the fur of a fragile creature. A connection born out of trust and understanding. It was a story he never tired of telling because it wasn't just about saving a deer. It was about what the deer had given him in return. A quiet strength, a bond with the natural world, and a reminder that every act of kindness mattered. Ethan grew into a young man, his love for nature turning into something much greater. His bedroom, once filled with drawings and daydreams, became a library of books on wildlife conservation and biology. His friends would often tease him for living in the clouds, but Ethan didn't mind. In his heart, he carried something most people didn't understand, a sacred promise to give back to the world that had gifted him so much. In high school, he spent hours volunteering at animal shelters and rehabilitating wildlife at a small rescue center outside of town. He worked under an old man named Henry, who'd spent decades nursing injured animals back to health. Henry was gruff at first, but as he watched Ethan work tirelessly, his demeanor softened. "You know," Henry said one afternoon as they tended to an injured bird, "people like you are rare. It takes more than just love to do this work. It takes patience, grit, and heart. The animals know it, too. They sense it in you." Ethan smiled, humbled by the words. "I guess I just feel like it's my responsibility. Like someone's got to care, you know?" Henry nodded, his weathered hands gentle as he bandaged the bird's wing. "That deer of yours gave you something most people don't find until they're much older. A purpose." And Henry was right. Ethan knew his purpose was bigger than himself, bigger than just one act of kindness. It was about building a legacy of compassion, a ripple that would carry on long after he was gone. Years later, as Ethan prepared to leave for college, he found himself walking down the same forest road where it all began. The world around him felt alive with memory. The rustle of the leaves, the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, the faint sound of distant birdsong. He stood still in the center of the road, closing his eyes and breathing deeply. When he opened them again, he could almost see her, the doe standing quietly at the edge of the forest, her eyes locked with his. He smiled softly, knowing it was just his imagination, but the feeling remained. A part of her, he realized, would always be with him. His parents stood nearby, watching him from the car. They didn't interrupt. They had learned over time to understand what this place meant to their son. "I'm going to miss this," Ethan said as he finally walked back to them, his voice heavy with emotion. His mother pulled him into a hug. "This place will always be here for you, Ethan. And so will we." His father clapped him on the back, a rare smile breaking through his stoic demeanor. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, son. Don't forget where you come from." "I won't," Ethan promised. And he wouldn't. College took Ethan far from his small town, but the lessons he learned as a boy never left him. He majored in wildlife biology, throwing himself into his studies with the same quiet determination that had always set him apart. Professors noticed his passion, his drive to understand the intricate connections between animals, humans, and the environment. But even in the busy halls of the university, Ethan often found himself thinking of home. On long nights in the library, he would pause, close his eyes, and picture the forest bathed in golden light. The deer watching him with gentle eyes kept him grounded, reminding him of who he was and why he was there. During his sophomore year, Ethan took part in a wildlife rehabilitation project in a nearby national park. One crisp morning, As the team set out to release a group of rescued deer into the wild, Ethan froze at the edge of the clearing. A doe stepped forward, her coat shimmering in the morning sun. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Ethan couldn't help but wonder, could it be her? The deer he had saved all those years ago? Of course, he knew it wasn't likely. But as the doe turned to look at him, her gaze steady and knowing, Ethan felt the same connection he had felt as a boy. A warmth spread through his chest, and he knew. Whether it was the same deer or not didn't matter. What mattered was that he had been part of something greater, part of a world where kindness created ripples that stretched farther than he could ever see. As the deer bounded into the forest, Ethan smiled, a single tear sliding down his cheek. This was his place. This was his purpose. Years later, Ethan returned home to visit his aging parents. He was no longer the quiet boy who had knelt in the middle of a road. He was a man now, with stories of his own and a heart still rooted in the place where it all began. On his first evening back, he wandered into the forest, the golden light of sunset filtering through the trees. He knelt in the same spot where he had once saved a life, his hand brushing against the earth as if to say thank you. In that moment, he heard a soft rustle behind him. Turning slowly, he saw a deer standing just a few feet away. She watched him with calm, curious eyes, her presence so quiet it felt almost otherworldly. Ethan didn't move. He didn't need to. The deer lingered for a moment longer before disappearing into the trees, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. But he didn't feel alone, not really. He felt connected to something far greater than himself, something ancient and beautiful. Years later, when Ethan had children of his own, he brought them to that same forest. As they walked the winding trails, his kids bombarded him with questions. "Did you really save a deer here, Dad?" his youngest asked, her voice full of wonder. Ethan smiled, ruffling her hair. "I did. And she saved me, too, in a way." His oldest tilted his head, confused. "How can a deer save a person?" Ethan knelt down, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes, it's not about saving someone's life. Sometimes, it's about showing them the kind of person they want to be." The kids fell quiet, letting his words sink in as they continued down the path. Ethan looked up at the canopy above, sunlight filtering through the leaves in familiar patterns. He knew that somewhere, deep in the forest, the descendants of the deer he saved still roamed, free, alive, and carrying forward a quiet legacy of connection and kindness. And in his heart, Ethan carried that legacy too, because kindness, he knew, never truly ended. It was passed on, like the setting sun handing its light to the stars. And for as long as he lived, he would keep that light alive.